The rain had been falling all day, turning the streets of the alien city into long, silver rivers. Merchants shouted from under their canopies, trying to sell the last of their goods before the storm grew worse. Lights from neon signs reflected on the wet pavement, making the streets glow in strange colors. Evan, a human trader, moved quickly through the crowd. His coat pulled tight. He only wanted to reach his small shop before night came, but then, in the middle of the noise and rain, he heard it. It was a cry, thin, weak, and almost lost under the sound of the storm. He stopped, tilting his head. There it was again, soft, desperate, and coming from somewhere close. The sound led him toward a narrow alley between two tall buildings. Most people walked past without looking. The alley was dark, the kind of place no one wanted to step into, but something in that cry pulled him forward. Water dripped from wires overhead as Evan stepped into the shadows. The smell of damp stone and rotting trash filled the air. Halfway down the alley, he saw her, an alien woman, sitting on the cold ground, her back against the wall. Her clothes were torn and soaked, her hair plastered to her face. In her arms were 3 small bundles wrapped in thin cloth. The bundles moved slightly, and Evan realized they were not things, they were babies. The woman's eyes lifted slowly, meeting his. She looked exhausted, her skin pale and her hands trembling. One of the babies whimpered, a sound too soft for such a wet and cold night. "Please," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "Help us." Evan stepped closer, his boots splashing in shallow puddles. "What happened?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. She tightened her grip on the babies, as if afraid he might take them away. "My mate. He's gone," she said slowly. "The factory collapsed. I have nothing left. No food, no shelter." Her voice shook, but she kept rocking the babies gently. "They haven't eaten since yesterday," she added, from the street behind Evan. A man's voice called, "Don't bother with her. Bad luck follows her kind." The footsteps passed, the voice fading into the market noise. Evan ignored it and looked back at the woman. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. She shook her head, her eyes lowering in shame. "No one will help me," she said. "Not with 3 mouths to feed." Evan glanced at the babies, their small faces almost hidden in the thin fabric. One's tiny hand reached out weakly, fingers curling in the air, without thinking. He removed his coat and stepped closer. "Here," he said, wrapping it around her and the children. The thick fabric seemed to surprise her, and she stared at him with disbelief. "You'll get cold," she said. "I'll be fine." He replied, "You need it more." He reached into his bag and took out a small packet of dried food and a flask of water. "Eat," he said, setting them beside her. She looked at the food, hesitated, then nodded slowly as she began to eat. One of the babies whimpered again. Evan crouched down and held out his arms. "Let me keep one warm while you eat," he said. Her eyes widened. "You would? Hold them?" she asked quietly. He nodded, with great care. She placed one of the tiny creatures into his arms. The baby was light, too light, and barely warm. Evan pulled it close to his chest, feeling the faint, fast heartbeat against him, the small sound. It made not quite a cry, but not silence, made him tighten his hold. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lyra," she said softly, "and these are mine, my only family now." He looked down at the baby in his arms and then back at her. "Lyra," he said, "you can't stay here. It's too cold, too dangerous." Her mouth twisted into a tired, bitter smile. "And where else can I go?" Everyone shuts their doors. Evan glanced toward the busy street. Then back to her. "Come with me," he said. "I have a place. It's small, but warm." She stared at him like she couldn't believe his words. "Why?" she asked. He looked down at the baby again, its tiny face pressed against his shirt. "Because they need you alive," he said simply. "And you need help to keep them alive." For a long moment, The only sound was the rain. Finally, she gave a small nod. Evan handed the baby back gently and helped her to her feet. Her legs shook, and she leaned against him as they walked toward the market. People turned their heads as they passed, some curious, some frowning, some whispering, but Evan kept walking steady and calm. Ignoring them all, the trip to his place was slow. The triplets making soft noises now and then. By the time they reached his building, Lyra was exhausted. He unlocked the door to his apartment above the shop and guided her inside. The warm air made her let out a long breath, her shoulders finally relaxing. Evan fetched a blanket and wrapped it around her and the babies. "You can rest here tonight," he said. She met his eyes for a moment and whispered, "Thank you." "Human?" He smiled faintly. "Name's Evan," he said, "and you're safe now." But as he looked at her and the 3 fragile lives in her arms, he knew this was only the beginning. The room was small but warm, a sharp contrast to the cold rain outside. Dim light from a single lamp filled the space, casting soft shadows across the worn furniture. Evan set his coat on a chair and moved toward the small stove in the corner. The faint smell of wood and metal hung in the air, the scent of a place lived in for years. Lyra sat stiffly on the couch, the triplets bundled in the blanket he had given her. They were quiet now, their little breaths shallow but steady. "You should eat something," Evan said, pulling a pot from the shelf. Lyra shook her head at first. "They need to eat first," she said, her voice low. Evan gave a small nod. Searching a drawer until he found a clean bottle, he filled it with warm milk from a container in the cupboard and handed it to her. She took it slowly, adjusting one of the babies in her arms and feeding it with practiced care. The others stirred, so Evan prepared more bottles, handing them to her one by one. When the babies were fed and wrapped tightly again, she finally accepted the bowl of broth he placed in front of her. The steam curled into the air, and she inhaled deeply before taking a small sip. It was simple food, but the warmth spread through her quickly. Evan sat across from her with a mug of tea. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the clink of the spoon and the faint hum of the stove. "You live here, alone?" she asked after a while. "Yes," Evan said. "The shop is downstairs. I work on repairs, trade parts when I can." She looked around the small space, taking in the shelves filled with tools, the stacks of boxes in the corner. "It's quiet here," she murmured. "Quieter than the market," he replied with a faint smile. "But I like it that way." Usually, her eyes lowered, her fingers brushing the edge of the blanket. "You didn't have to bring me here," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "But I wanted to." Her gaze lifted to meet his. "You don't even know me," she said. "I know you needed help," he answered simply. That was enough. The rain outside had eased into a steady drizzle, tapping lightly against the window. Evan stood and went to a small cupboard, pulling out a folded set of clothes. "They're old, but dry," he said. Offering them to her, she hesitated, then accepted them with a quiet thank you, while she went to change in the small bathroom. Evan moved the coffee table aside and arranged the couch into a place she could sleep. He set out extra blankets, smoothing them over the cushions when she returned. The clothes hung loosely on her frame, but she looked warmer. Her hair was still damp, and she pushed it back from her face as she sat again. "They haven't been warm like this in a long time," she admitted. Evan didn't ask for details. The grief in her voice told him enough. She glanced toward the window. "I'm not used to kindness," she said quietly. "After the factory collapse, people avoided me. They said I was cursed, that my children would bring ruin." Evan frowned. "They're just children," he said. "In this city, that doesn't matter." She replied, her tone flat. "Then maybe the city's wrong," he said. A soft cry came from the basket at her feet, and she bent down to soothe the smallest triplet. Her voice was low, humming an unfamiliar tune. Evan listened. his hands wrapped around his tea mug. The melody was gentle, but there was a sadness in it that made him think of empty nights and long roads. When the baby was calm again, she looked up at him. "You're good with them?" she said, almost in surprise. "I'm learning," he replied with a small smile. "Not much choice now." Her lips twitched as if she wanted to smile, but wasn't sure if it was allowed. Hours passed slowly, the warmth of the stove filling the room. Lyra's eyes began to close, but she fought to stay awake. "You should sleep," Evan said. "I'll keep watch." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. She settled on the couch with the triplets close to her, their tiny hands gripping the blanket. Within minutes, her breathing evened out. Evan sat in the chair nearby. Watching the rise and fall of the blanket as they slept, he thought about how easily he could have walked past that alley. About how close they had been to not surviving the night. There was no question in his mind bringing them here had been the right choice, and he knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to be a one-night shelter. They were here to stay. When dawn broke, pale light crept through the blinds. Lyra stirred, opening her eyes slowly. The triplets were still sleeping peacefully. She looked at Evan, who was already making breakfast. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied softly, her voice carrying something new, a trace of hope for the first time in a long while. She felt like she wasn't completely alone, and that thought, fragile as it was enough to keep her going. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the streets wet and shining under the pale light. From the window above his shop, Evan could see the market already waking up. Merchants lifted the shutters of their stalls, voices calling out as they arranged baskets of fruit, bolts of cloth, and tools. The air smelled of bread baking in the ovens and fresh spices carried by the breeze. "We should get supplies," Evan said. Turning to Lyra, she sat on the couch with the triplets in her lap. Feeding one while the others rested, her eyes flicked toward the window. "The market will be busy," she said quietly. "Too many eyes." Evan gave a small shrug. "They'll look," he said, "but we're not hiding." Lyra wrapped the triplets carefully in a soft blanket, tucking them into the sling across her chest. They were small and warm against her, their tiny breaths steady. Together, she and Evan stepped into the street. The sound of the market grew louder with every step, merchants shouting prices, wheels of carts rattling over cobblestones, the laughter of children darting between stalls. It didn't take long for the stares to start. Heads turned as they passed, voices dropping too low. Murmurs, "That's her," someone whispered. "The widow," another said, "with the human." Lyra kept her gaze on the ground, her steps quick. She had lived with whispers for months. But somehow they felt heavier with Evan walking beside her. He didn't speed up or slow down, moving with the same calm stride, as if the voices didn't exist. Their first stop was a food stall run by a stocky alien with thick hands. "What do you need?" he asked, his tone flat. "Bread, dried fruit, and milk powder," Evan said. The merchant filled the order without smiling. When it came time to hand back the change, he placed it in Evan's hand. Not Lyra's, she noticed, but said nothing. At the fabric stall, things were worse. The merchant stepped back as they approached. "I don't deal with her kind," he said sharply. Evan's jaw tightened. "Your loss," he replied. Turning away, Lyra's cheeks burned, but she kept her head down. "You don't have to defend me," she murmured. "I'm not defending you," Evan said. "I'm treating you like anyone else." They moved on to the spice district, where the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, pepper, and sweet herbs. A tea vendor called out to Evan, "Human, try this blend." Evan glanced at Lyra. "Want some?" She hesitated, then nodded. The tea was hot and fragrant, warming her hands as they sipped. For a moment, the noise of the market faded, and she allowed herself to breathe, but the peace didn't last. Two young men leaned against a nearby wall, watching them. One nudged the other and spoke loud enough to be heard. Look at him carrying bags for her like he's her mate. The other laughed. Maybe he is. Lyra stiffened, her grip tightening on the sling. Evan didn't even turn toward them. Come on, he said quietly. Leading her away, at the far end of the market, they stopped at a small corner stall. Run by an elderly shopkeeper with pale green skin, he greeted them with a warm smile. I remember you, he said to Lyra. You used to pass here with your mate, carrying shipments. Lyra blinked in surprise. Yes, she said softly. The shopkeeper glanced at the babies, then disappeared into the back when he returned. He handed her a neatly folded blanket for the little ones. He said, no charge. Lyra's lips parted, but no words came. She bowed her head, murmuring, thank you, with their bags full. They made their way back through the market. Some people stared, others turned away, but a few gave small nods or brief smiles. Back at the shop, Lyra laid the triplets in their basket. Smoothing the new blanket over them, they'll sleep well in this, she murmured. Almost to herself, Evan began unpacking the supplies. You noticed it, didn't you? He asked without looking up. What? Ka? Lyra said. That not everyone looked at you the same way today, he replied. She paused, thinking of the old shopkeeper's smile, the tea vendor's friendly call. Maybe, she admitted. Small steps, Evan said. That's how it changes. That evening, as the market outside grew quiet, Lyra sat by the window. The triplets slept peacefully, their small hands curling around the edges of the blanket. She could still hear the whispers in her mind. The cruel ones, the curious ones, but alongside them were moments of kindness. The market hadn't accepted her fully, but for the first time, she felt the wall between her and the world was starting to weaken, and maybe, just maybe, she and her children could have a place here. The days after their trip to the market were calmer. Lyra kept mostly inside, caring for the triplets and helping Evan in the shop when she could. The babies were growing stronger, their cries louder, and sometimes they made soft, happy sounds. That made the small shop feel warmer. Evan began to think they might finally be settling into a rhythm. But peace in this city was always fragile. It was late evening when the trouble came. The market had gone quiet. Most stalls closed, and the street outside was lit only by the dull glow of the lamps. Evan was at the workbench repairing a small power tool while Lyra sat nearby, feeding one of the triplets. The sudden, heavy pounding on the front door made her jump. The baby whimpered, and she held it closer. The pounding came again. Louder this time, a rough voice shouted, "Open up." Evan set down his tool and walked to the door, peering through the narrow glass panel. 3 figures stood outside, the same rough-looking men he had noticed watching them in the market before. Their faces were shadowed under hoods, but their posture carried open hostility. "What do you want?" Evan called through the door. The tallest stepped forward. "You've got something in there that doesn't belong," the man said, his voice full of contempt. Evan's eyes narrowed. "If you mean my employee, she belongs here as much as—" "I do," he replied. Behind him, Lyra's voice was tight. "Don't let them in," she whispered. Her arms tightened around the baby. Evan gave her a brief, reassuring nod before turning back to the door. "You should leave," he said firmly. "This isn't your business." The man laughed, a harsh sound in the empty street. "It's everyone's business when she's bringing bad luck to the market." He said, "You think people haven't noticed you keeping her here? A widow with 3 mouths to feed. Everyone knows how that ends." Evan's voice was calm, but carried a sharp edge. "How it ends," he said, "depends on whether people like you keep causing trouble." The tallest stepped closer, placing his hand on the doorframe. "You can't protect her forever," he said. "Maybe not," Evan replied evenly. "But I can protect her right now." He unlocked the bolt and opened the door just enough to step into the doorway. "Blocking their path, you're not coming inside," he said, his tone flat. One of the men tried to push forward, but Evan's arm shot out, stopping him cold. The man's smirk faltered. But before anything more could happen, a voice called from across the street, "What's going on here?" It was the old fabric shopkeeper, the one who had given Lyra the blanket. He stood outside his stall with arms crossed, his voice carrying easily through the quiet street. The three men glanced at him, then noticed a few other merchants leaning out of their doorways, watching. The attention seemed to make them hesitate. The tallest man's sneer returned, but his tone was lower now. "This isn't over," he muttered. They turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the distance. Evan closed the door and locked it again. Lyra was still standing in the same spot. The baby pressed against her chest. Her breathing was quick, but her voice was steady when she said, "They'll come back. Then they'll find I'm still here." Evan replied without hesitation. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were searching his face, as if trying to understand why he would risk this much. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you doing this for me and my children?" Evan didn't hesitate. "Because you deserve the same safety anyone else does," he said, "and they deserve to grow up without fear." The rest of the evening passed quietly, though the tension lingered. Evan worked at the bench again, the hum of his tools steady. Lyra sat with the triplets, watching their tiny chests rise and fall as they slept. Every so often, her gaze drifted to the door. She still felt the echo of the pounding from earlier, but she also remembered the way Evan had stood there, unflinching, until the men backed down. Later that night, when the shop was dark and the market silent, Lyra lay awake on the couch. The triplets were nestled between her and the wall, warm and safe. Her mind turned over the events of the evening, again and again. For months, she had only known people who shut their doors against her. Now there was someone who opened his and then stood guard to keep it open. It was a strange feeling, this fragile sense of protection. She didn't trust it completely yet, but she knew one thing for certain: Evan wasn't like the others. The next morning, the market was busier than usual. The air was alive with voices calling out prices, the clatter of carts, and the scent of fresh bread mixed with roasted spices. Evan's shop door stayed open to invite customers, and the sound of the triplets' soft babbling drifted out onto the street. Lyra kept them close in their basket while she wiped the counter and arranged small repaired items on the shelves. By midday, a shadow filled the doorway. A tall alien man stepped inside, dressed in fine robes embroidered with gold thread. 2 guards waited outside, their armor catching the sunlight. In the merchant's hands was a black case, long and heavy. Evan greeted him politely. "What brings you here?" The merchant placed the case on the counter with deliberate care. "I've heard you can repair anything," he said, unlocking it. Inside, cushioned by dark fabric, was a rare energy core. Its polished metal surface shimmered faintly, and a steady blue pulse glowed from its center. Lyra had never seen one in person. She knew it was worth more than almost every shop in the market combined. "This needs to be fixed before sundown," the merchant said. Evan examined it briefly. "I can do it, but it will take time," he said. Just then, another regular customer arrived with a broken water filter. Evan glanced between the two jobs, thinking quickly. He turned to Lyra. "Watch the core for me while I get the parts for the filter," he said. The merchant's eyes narrowed. "You'd leave this with her?" he asked sharply. "She works here," Evan replied evenly. The merchant's lips curled slightly. "I know her kind," he muttered. "You might come back and find it missing." Evan's voice stayed calm, but his words carried weight. "Then you'll see you're wrong," he said before heading to the back. The shop seemed quieter after he left. The hum of the energy core filled the space. Steady and soft, Lyra stood behind the counter, aware of the merchant's sharp gaze on her. From outside, 2 other merchants lingered near the doorway, pretending to chat but really watching her every move. She could feel it, the suspicion pressing on her like a heavy coat. The triplets shifted in their basket, one letting out a small cry. Lyra bent down, adjusting the blanket and humming softly until they settled again. Her hands itched to work on something. Keeping still under so many eyes was harder than she thought. Then a small voice called from the doorway. It was a boy holding a broken toy drone. "It won't fly anymore," he said shyly. Lyra glanced at the merchant, who was still watching her, then back at the boy. She could repair the wing quickly without touching the core. "Come here," she said gently. The boy stepped forward. Placing the toy on the counter, she found a small screwdriver, tightened the loose wing, and reattached a wire within minutes. The drone's propellers spun again. The boy's face lit up. "Thank you," he said before running off. The merchant's eyes followed the child, then returned to Lyra. "You could have taken it," he said suddenly. "The toy?" she asked, confused. "The core," he replied. "You could sell it and live in comfort." For years, Lyra's voice was steady. "And then I'd have nothing. No trust. No place, no home." For a moment, the merchant said nothing. His gaze softened slightly, but it was gone just as quickly. Evan returned with the filter parts and saw Lyra standing exactly where he'd left her. "All good?" he asked, untouched. She replied simply. Evan smiled faintly. "I knew it would be." He repaired the core while Lyra tended to the triplets. By late afternoon, the device pulsed with steady blue light again. The merchant tested it, found it perfect, and closed the case. "You work with honest hands," he said to Lyra before leaving. The words weren't warm, but they weren't bitter either, and for someone like him, that meant something. When the shop was quiet again, Evan leaned on the counter. "I didn't leave the core with you because I needed someone to watch it," he said. Lyra tilted her head. "Then why?" "I wanted everyone to see. I trust you," he replied. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She wasn't used to someone risking their reputation for her. Yet here was a human doing exactly that, without hesitation. That evening, as the lamps flickered on in the market, Lyra stepped outside for a moment. A few neighbors passed by and gave her small nods. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was more than cold stares. She thought about the merchant's final words, the boy's bright smile, and Evan's unwavering trust. For the first time in a long time, she felt something changing. Not fast, but enough to give her hope for tomorrow. The morning began like any other. The market outside was alive with movement, the sound of voices rising and falling like waves. Lyra was sweeping the shop floor while the triplets played in their basket with wooden rings Evan had carved for them. The smell of warm bread from the bakery down the lane drifted in. For a moment, life almost felt normal. Then, without warning, a loud crash shattered the calm. The front window of the shop burst inward as something heavy smashed through it, scattering glass across the floor. Lyra froze, her breath catching in her throat. Evan was at the counter, but the noise had him moving instantly toward the triplets. Two hooded figures stepped through the broken frame, their boots crunching on the shards. They carried short steel rods, the kind that could stun or kill with a single strike. "You were warned, human," one of them said. His voice was low but thick with menace. "You can't keep her here. She's poison to this market." Lyra's heart pounded. She stepped between the intruders and the basket where her children sat. Her arms slightly spread. The taller man's gaze dropped to the triplets. "3 more mouths to ruin us," he sneered. "Let's end this before it spreads." Evan moved fast, placing himself in front of Lyra. "Touch them," he said, his voice like steel. "Or you won't leave this street." The intruder laughed, but his eyes flickered uneasily from outside. A few merchants had stopped what they were doing. Faces appeared in nearby doorways, watching. Some whispered, but no one stepped forward yet. The shorter attacker lunged toward Evan, swinging His rod, Evan dodged, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it sharply. The rod clattered to the floor. Lyra kicked it away. Her eyes fixed on the second man who was circling toward the triplets. She snatched a wooden stool and held it like a shield. Her hands shaking, but her stance firm. "Move aside, widow," the second man growled. Lyra's voice shook, but her words were clear. "No one touches my children." He stepped closer, but Evan's hand shot out, gripping the man's shoulder and yanking him backward. The motion sent the attacker stumbling into the street, right in view of the growing crowd. Now, voices were calling out, "Enough. Leave them alone." It wasn't everyone, but a few of the merchants who had once turned away were stepping forward. The old fabric seller was there, holding a wooden pole like a staff, behind him. The boy whose drone Lyra had fixed stood with his father, both blocking. The alley, the taller intruder glanced around and saw the shift in the street. The watching eyes, the raised voices, the tide turning against them. He pulled the shorter man up from the ground. "This isn't over." He spat toward Evan. Then they disappeared into the crowd, vanishing before the city guards arrived. Evan closed the shop door and locked it. Though the window was still shattered, Lyra stood frozen for a moment, the stool still in her hands. When she finally set it down, she realized her legs were trembling. Evan placed a hand on her shoulder. "They're gone," he said quietly, her eyes filled with tears. Not just from fear, but from the strange sight she'd just witnessed, people in the market standing between her children and harm. Even if only for a moment, the guards took a report. But Evan knew the men would not be found quickly. Still, something had changed. Word of the attack would spread. And so would the sight of who had defended whom, that night, as Evan boarded up the window. Lyra sat nearby with the triplets asleep beside her. She kept replaying the moment she had stood in front of her children. She had been terrified, but she hadn't moved. Evan hadn't moved either. Later, when the market was dark, Lyra spoke softly. "Today?" "They saw me," she said. Evan glanced over. "They've always seen you," he replied. "But now they're starting to see who you are." Lyra didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the boarded window, but her mind was on the faces. In the crowd, the fabric seller, the boy with the drone, the merchants who had once turned away. Something was shifting in the air around her. It wasn't safety yet, but it was the start of belonging. The morning after the attack was quiet, too quiet. Lyra thought as she swept the floor of the shop. Evan was fixing the window, hammering the last wooden frame into place. The triplets played nearby, rolling a cloth ball between them, their laughter. Light and pure, outside, the market moved at a slower pace than usual. As if the whole street was thinking about yesterday, Lyra expected fewer customers, maybe even more cold stares. But instead, something unexpected happened. The first to walk in was the old fabric seller. He placed a folded piece of bright cloth on the counter. "For the children," he said simply. Lyra opened it and saw it was a blanket with fine stitching before she could speak. He added, "You stood like a wall yesterday for that. You have my respect," and left without waiting for payment. Not long after, the boy with the repaired drone came by, holding a basket. His father stood behind him, inside. "Were fresh fruits and a small jar of honey. It's from us," the father said. "Not payment, just thanks." Lyra felt her throat tighten. No one had given her something without expecting something back in return. As the day went on, more small acts followed. A baker left warm rolls at the door. A spice seller dropped off a small pouch of herbs for health. Even those who didn't step inside began nodding to her when they passed. It wasn't everyone. Some still looked away, but it was enough to feel different. Evan noticed too, though he said nothing, only smiling faintly whenever he saw her surprised expression. By evening, the shop was busier than it had been in weeks. Customers came not only for Evan's work, but to see the woman who had stood in front of her children with a stool. Some asked quietly about the triplets. Lyra told them their names one by one. Her voice soft but proud each time. She caught Evan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, a mix of pride and something warmer. One night, a week after the attack, Lyra was closing the shutters when Evan spoke. "You know," he began, "I used to think this shop was the only thing I needed." She glanced at him, curious. "And now?" "Now I think I was wrong," he said, his eyes briefly meeting hers before looking away. Lyra felt a strange flutter in her chest. She didn't reply, but the warmth in her cheeks lingered. The triplets had started calling Evan something new. 2. It began one quiet afternoon when the smallest of them toddled up to him. Holding out a wooden ring. "Da," the child said softly. Evan froze. The tool in his hand still halfway to the counter. Lyra's eyes widened. She hadn't taught them that word. The other two soon copied it, their voices bright and certain. Evan crouched down, smiling in a way Lyra had never seen before. Lay didn't correct them, and she didn't either. By the end of the month, the broken window was fully replaced. The shop shelves were better stocked, and the space felt alive again. But more than that, felt safe. Not because trouble had vanished, but because they weren't alone anymore. Neighbors still argued, prices still rose and fell. And not everyone liked her, yet there was no mistaking the change. She belonged here now. At least enough to stand without fear every time the shop door opened. One rainy evening, after the shutters were closed and the lanterns lit, Evan sat with Lyra at the small table in the back. The triplets were asleep in their corner, curled together under the bright blanket the fabric seller had given. Lyra held her cup of tea, watching the steam rise. "You gave me more than work," she said quietly. Evan looked at her. "You gave me more than a helper," he replied. For a moment, neither spoke. But there was no need. The silence was warm, not empty. When the rain eased, the sound of the market outside returned, distant laughter, the creak of carts, the call of a late vendor. Lyra thought of the day she had walked into this shop with nothing but her children and her name. Now she had a place, a roof, and people who would stand for her if trouble came. And somehow, the human who had once been just her employer had become the center of it all. She looked at Evan then, really looked and understood why the triplets called him Da, because in their eyes, and perhaps in hers, he already was. And maybe, she thought as the rain started again, that was exactly what he wanted to be. Asterisk.